Hello everyone, this is Sahir, and today we're going to talk about the Hebrew letter Tav. I've decided to do a series discussing each Hebrew letter one at a time, starting from the ending and ending at the beginning of the Hebrew alphabet. For those of you who work in Kabbalah or Hermeticism, know that we start at the bottom of the tree of life and we work our way up. So we're going to be doing the same with the Hebrew alphabet. Many of you may know that each Hebrew letter has multiple layers and meanings that kind of tie into an overall picture. So I'm here to offer my understanding of each letter that I've acquired through my own work, my own studies and practices. So before we begin, let's talk about a few little facts about the letter Tav first. Tav equals the number 400. Tav has meanings known as a mark or stamp, cross, sign, or seal. It corresponds to the 31st path leading from Malkut, the kingdom, to Yesod, the foundation on the tree of life. Tav also corresponds to the universe of the tarot cards and corresponds to the planet Saturn in astrology. Just a few things to keep in mind as we start the discussion that will help you get a better picture of certain things we talk about. So the main things we will focus on with Tav today is seeing Tav as cosmic resistance, seeing Tav as faith and truth, seeing it as a mark or stamp or seal, as well as seeing it as a cross and also how it relates to the word judgment. So Tav is a synthesis or completion of all of the Hebrew letters from Aleph to Tav. The word Ot, meaning miraculous signs, the thing itself, wonder, or essence, begins with the first letter Aleph and ends with the last letter Tav. So the Hebrew letters help to describe the thing itself, or essence, and its divine workings which describe God or creation. I know some of you prefer other words than God, and feel free to use whatever word you feel comfortable with. When I say the word God, I refer to it as less of a noun and more of a verb. God as the ongoing action of creation, the endless spiraling energy or essence of creation and its flow of events. So Tav, again, is a mark of completion, the sum of everything. It is the completion of the human being, the completion of the work. Its numerical value is 400, which reduces to the base number 4. Its planetary sign is Saturn, which deals with limitations, constriction, restriction, life, death, time. So the first thing we're going to focus on is Tav as cosmic resistance. So let's take a look at the number 400 to begin. 400 reduces to the number 4, which is its base number. 4 is a number of stability, order, and completion. Think of the 4 cardinal points of east, west, north, south, the 4 winds, 4 seasons, 4 phases of the moon. 4 is therefore a number of resistance, since 4 is representative of stability. For something to remain stable and held together, a type of resistance is needed to keep it solidified. You can also think of the 4 elements, which plays a major part in the number 4. So the seasons, the working of the elements, the phases of the moon, cycles of nature, they can be seen as repetitions, which ironically is the word shinon in Hebrew, and it also equals 400, just like the letter Tav. So let's start with the number 400. As I've already noted, it reduces to the number 4 as its base number. So 4 is the Hebrew letter Dalet, which means door in Hebrew. Dalet can be seen as the doorway in which the unseen world of spirit becomes the visible world of matter. When we take 4 and we multiply it by 10, the number of the Sephirot on the tree of life, and as well as the number of completion in numerology, 4 becomes 40. So 40 is the Hebrew letter Mem, which means water. This is another type of resistance that we will discuss when focusing on this letter. So these 3 letters relate to a type of resistance, moving from the most subtle to the most manifested, ending in 400 or Tav. Resistance relates to the feminine face of the divine, to the concept of form. The feminine archetype receives the force of the masculine or male archetype and contains it in order to manifest form and stability, which is a restriction of sorts. Again, 4, going back to that stability, when I say resistance, I mean that 4 represents form, and form must have some sort of resistance in order to hold it together. Without that resistance, form would cease to exist. It wouldn't be able to stay together. Just like the atoms and molecules that hold your body together and all other physical manifestation. So let's take a look at these 3 numbers that we've mentioned, 4, 40, and 400. 4 equals Dalet, which equals Venus, a goddess archetype. 40 equals Mem, which equals water, the passive feminine element relating to the divine mother archetype. And 400 equals Tav, which equals Saturn. In the Kabbalah, Saturn is Bina, the mother archetype, the cosmic creatrix. So all 3 relate to aspects of the goddess, the feminine face of divinity, which again resembles form where resistance takes place. Tav is seen as the completion of the physical universe, the cosmic resistance which holds it together, allowing the flow of events to take place through the use of the 4 elements that make up physical reality. Again, going back to this number 4. I've already mentioned Saturn, and I will say again that Saturn represents qualities of constriction, limitation, again referring to some sort of resistance. It not only stands for resistance in the physical world, but also resistance within ourselves. Other concepts that relate to Saturn are time and life and death, something that will tie into this lecture as we continue. So the word death, Mavet, is spelt with Mem, Vav, and Tav. So we see that Tav seals death. It ends with it. Our obstacles, our limitations, things that we naturally resist in life, yet that lead to spiritual growth and personal development when taken head on. By overcoming these things we resist in life, we are led to a certain spiritual death as well as a rebirth or resurrection. It's good when working with certain spiritual practices to remember that 50% of our wisdom comes from failure, as well as suffering. So as I mentioned also in the beginning, the 31st path of Tav leads from the physical universe of Malkut to the vital etheric world which creation rests upon, Yesod, the foundation. Yesod is seen as the machinery of the universe, allowing these repetitions and cycles to take place through the flow of time in the physical world. Once again, this shows this cosmic resistance at work, marrying and bridging these 2 worlds together, allowing creation to continue. The vital life force of Yesod is like the battery of the universe, and this is represented as the tarot card, the universe. It might help to study this card and keep these ideas in mind, and you might come up with some more significant symbolisms looking at the card. So let's move on to the middle pillar, which is representative of equilibrium in the Kabbalah. It can also be seen as a sort of marriage or bondage of the concepts of force and form. Now take a look at the Sephirot on the middle pillar. We have Keter, which contains a Tav in its center, spelled Kaf, Tav, Resh. We look at the next Sephirah, Tiferet. Tiferet contains Tav in its beginning as well as its end, spelled Tav, Pe, Aleph, Resh, Tav. And then at the bottom we have Malkut, which contains a Tav at its end, spelled Mem, Lamed, Kaf, Vav, Tav. The invisible Sephirah of Dot also contains a Tav at the end, spelled Dalet, Ayin, Tav. When we study Kabbalah, we have this saying that Keter is in Malkut and Malkut is in Keter. Both contain the Tav, containing them and binding them. So, although there are other meanings to this saying, this is a little clue that shows that they're intimately connected through this letter. So let's talk about the word justice for a moment. Justice is the law of divinity or nature. Justice is this concept that it's always seeking to balance everything in ultimate equilibrium, again, relating to the middle pillar, which holds the principles of force and form together. The tarot card of justice relates to this concept of equilibrium as well as its astrological sign Libra, meaning the scales. There's a saying in the book of Revelation which says, "Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life." This crown is a mark, a tav, as we mentioned earlier in the lecture, that tav can mean mark, stamp, or seal. And this crown is relating to Kether, the crown. Notice the middle letter of Kether is tav. That tav is central to Kether, its very point of equilibrium in the middle of the word, symbolizing justice. That crown is Kether, and Kether is the entrance into and out of manifestation. It is the crown of life. So not only do we find resistance in a macrocosmic sense, but there's also resistance in the microcosmic sense within the human. So going back to Saturn as limitations, obstacles, that which seems to resist against us in our lives, things we must overcome. I like to look at Saturn as this sort of strict mother archetype that tells us what we're doing wrong in life, things that we need to work on, things we need to overcome in order to grow stronger and progress on our spiritual journey. So in human beings, Tav can be seen as our personal limitation, which is made clear through events that happen to us. Whenever we feel that Tav is interfering with us, it means that we must treat it as an opportunity in order to break up rigid structures within us that impede upon our spiritual growth. I want to bring up the word ta, tav aleph, which means cell in Hebrew, as in a dark room where we live as a prisoner, unable to see the outside of our limitations. Notice that this word is ot, but spelled backwards. So when one succeeds in freeing themselves from the obstacles that are resistance towards their growth, they eliminate a shell of fear the psyche is trapped in. They escape from that dark cell, ta, that which held aleph or spirit back. The ta now becomes the ot, the essence, the wonder, the miraculous sign. And notice now that aleph is in the lead. That resistance of tav now holds the spirit in the forefront. So a good story that represents this bondage that takes place, this resistance due to things that we have going against us in our lives, and our overcoming of them as well, is the story of the enslavement of Egypt. Many of you might not be familiar with these biblical stories, and that's not a problem. Just bear with me. You'll get the gist of it and the overall picture of what I'm trying to say. So the bondage of Egypt lasted 400 years, again, symbolic of Tav. This was until Moses came. So let's look at the word Egypt first. In an esoteric sense, the word Egypt is the realm of substance and life that is in the depths of the body consciousness. To the unregenerate soul, it is the land of darkness, of mystery. So overall, Egypt signifies this sort of darkness of ignorance and obscurity. When we become aware of this sort of resistance that keeps us from our soul, we begin to partake in this fight for our survival, and our main opponent, the Pharaoh, can only be defeated by having complete faith in the divine. This is where faith also comes into the picture, mentioned as a meaning of Tav. The Pharaoh of Egypt can be seen as the ego. It's that ego that traps us in that obscurity and ignorance, or otherwise known as Egypt. So there's a Hebrew word, ta-mim, and it's spelled tav, mem, yod, mem. This word ta-mim means complete, whole, perfect, and it can also be related to innocence or integrity. Remember, tav is representing completeness, the completion of things. So let's take a look at the order of this word using the Hebrew letters and seeing how it relates to this story in a very secretive, clever way. So the first letter of the word Talmim, Tav, can signify the first 400 years in the time of enslavement. The second letter, Mem, represents the 40 years reflected in the time of the exile of Moses. When I say the word Moses, in an esoteric sense, I'm referring to a phase in consciousness that is concerned with moral law, a sort of higher consciousness. The third letter of Talmim is Yod. This is the 10 that is referencing to Moses on Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb, where he heard the voice of God. His influence of the divine then inspired him to lead the people of Israel out of Egypt. And in an esoteric sense, Israel is representative of spiritual consciousness. The last letter, Talmim, is Mem again. So this is the 40 years where Israel traveled through the desert, leading to the 40 days and nights on Mount Sinai, where Moses was receiving the commandments, the law, Tav as law. And this led the people of Israel making it to the promised land, or the redeemed body, the redeemed consciousness. So this story brings me to our next point of focus, Tav as law. This story demonstrates what happens when one overcomes that which is in resistance toward their spiritual growth, when one follows the law of the divine and becomes redeemed by it, or grows into their spiritual nature. This is shown by that hidden word which reflects this story, Talmim, and it leads to completeness, wholeness, integrity, innocence, the meaning of the word Talmim. So when I say law, many of you may be thinking I'm referring to a single law that rules them all. And there are multiple laws that we can talk about regarding the divine, and many different paths and religions that will state different things, different laws, sometimes the same things just simply written differently. So when I say the word law, I'm referring to laws of the universe, the laws that the creative substance we call divine follows. Examples of this are the law of cause and effect, how our actions, our words, our thoughts, all of these things have an effect. There is a reaction to every action. The law of rhythm, the flow of the universe, the flow of the events throughout the universe. The law of vibration, everything has a vibratory rate in the universe. The law of oneness, how all these complex things come from one substance, one deity, one ultimate. The law of polarity, every positive has a negative and every negative has a positive. Law of attraction, again referring to our actions, our thoughts, how we shape our reality and what we bring into it, what we attract through how we speak to others, how we think of others, how we act towards others. So again, there's other laws that we can bring up, but just as long as you get the sense of what I'm talking about, the laws of that substance, that divine, that God as a verb. So one may ponder some of these laws by studying that 31st path of Tav, the universe card, as well as the nature of Yesod and its effects upon Malkut, the physical world. No one is outside the connection of the divine. It is something that is deeply rooted within everyone, as a sort of eternal law that always exists. It will prosper if we choose to follow it, showing us the beauty and the truth of the reality we live in. There goes that word truth, and we said that we were going to discuss Tav as truth. So now you start to see these things coming together into one overall picture, and you will continue to see it taking place as we go on in this lecture. So by not learning to follow this law is the major cause of our suffering, and it is the major cause to die without having truly lived life. Again, cause and effect, if we're not careful with, our actions, our words, our thoughts, we basically can create a sort of karma that is not very good for us. It's not healing, it's not progressive towards our growth. Again, the law of oneness, seeing ourselves as separate entities, the grasp for power, the grasp for I'm better than you, the ego taking place, that Pharaoh of Egypt coming to the forefront of our mind, the law of rhythm, going against the flow of events that take place, and how that ultimately leads to suffering. So when we overcome these conditions, we begin to create a life that is a little bit more fulfilling, has more depth to it. Again, these are not laws that are rules, commandments, or precepts. They are laws that simply require us to be present in the moment, to have great observation of our internal mechanisms, how we think, how we feel, and realizing that we have the free will to change what we don't like. We eventually will discover that we are capable of reaching joy and change in our lives. This law is desired by everyone, ironically, whether consciously or unconsciously, yet most do not listen to it, even when it is there all along. This law acts as a sort of inner judge to the shaping of our lives. It's judging our actions, our words, our thoughts, etc., and it's shaping our outer reality to match it. As stated, when we learn to work with this universal substance, we tend to follow a more harmonious and deeper sense of life. When we resist and reject it, or simply have no awareness of it, we tend to suffer more and feel more of a shallowness to our lives. We don't really see the point of events that unfold in our lives. So looking at the structure of the letter Tav, Tav is composed of a Dalet and a Nun, which spells out the word Din, meaning to judge. It also spells out Dan, as in tribe of Dan. In the book of Genesis, it says, Dan shall judge his people. Some associate Dan to Scorpio in astrology. However, there are many people who associate it to Capricorn, which is a very interesting tie that we find because Capricorn, as you know, is ruled by Saturn. Tav corresponds to Saturn in astrology. In the Kabbalah, Dan is said to be a collector of sorts, which this is a deeper kind of Kabbalistic concept that you'll have to look into, the fallen sparks, the shattering of the vessels. In Kabbalah, it represents the collector of lost or fallen sparks, which represents one's loss of sense of purpose and meaning in life, which results in our errors. Another interesting use of these two letters that compose Tav is the word Adonai, meaning Lord, the divine name that is associated with the Sephirah of Malkut. Remember that Malkut ends with Tav and shares a special relationship to it. The spelling of Adonai is Aleph, Dalet, Nun, Yod. When we look at this word Din in the center of it, it can be seen as Aleph, the spirit, which is the judge in or of existence. So, going back to that word judgment, Tav as a judgment is the summation of our actions. At the end of our journeys, we receive a Tav, a judgment, as well as a mark or a stamp, which is a cosmic mathematical completion of every action, thought, feeling, movement, etc. It is the synthesis of our life, and from that calculation or judgment, we move on to our next journey. This mark or stamp from this judgment is the secret of reincarnation. It is the mark of previous lifetimes that we carry around with us. Saturn governs the concepts of life and death, as we mentioned. When you look at your birth chart, one's birth chart indicates karma, or cause and effect, that law of cause and effect, which we carry around from past lives. There are limitations, our challenges, resistances, lessons that we must learn and incorporate in this lifetime to consciously evolve to the next step. So moving on to the next meaning of Tav, Tav as a mark or a stamp. So Tav shows that this kingdom of Malkut, the physical universe, is the mark of God or the divine. Just as someone signs their names at the end of a letter, or you know how we used to stamp our signature or seal before sending a letter. Look at books, authors. the author, creating their seal of their story by marking their name under its title. Malkut, as the last of the Sephirot, is receiving the influence of the other 9. And that is seen as Tav, which is represented as the cross of the 4 elements in Malkut. It is the divine completion, and relates to the saying, "Your kingdom is the kingdom of all worlds." So for a second, I want to go back to the number 4 that we mentioned earlier in this lecture. In the Sephirah, or the Sephirot on the Tree of Life, the number 4 equals chesed, which is mercy or loving kindness. So chesed can be seen as the blueprint of creation, containing everything before it has even taken shape and form. This shows in a very intimate way that creation of the physical world of Malkut was an act of mercy, loving kindness. It was a gift, a work of art in which this author has left its stamp or mark for us to find. The divine didn't have to create the world, yet it chose to, and along the way it gave us free will, not asking for anything in return unless we make that conscious choice to give back. So how do we learn to see this world as having the mark of the divine within everything? How do we know that by following this internal law, we will overcome our resistance or obstacles? This brings us to the concepts of Tav as faith and truth. In order to learn to see the world as filled with the divine and to begin to follow these universal laws, or at least to begin working with them successfully, one needs to have some sort of faith. And if we struggle to have this faith in the beginning, it will eventually present itself to us with practicing persistence in our work. One of the first steps to spiritual development is the awakening of faith. So let's look at the name Abraham for a second. In the Bible, Abraham is said to be the first of all believers, relating to having absolute faith. We mentioned the Sephirah of Chesed, number 4. In the Kabbalah, Abraham is the personification of Chesed, and it represents our innermost being, which is at the root unconditional love. This faith is the meaning behind the story of Abraham buying the cave of Machpelah for 400 shekel. Again, seeing that number 400. This is a symbol of our inner inheritance. So the cave of Machpelah is a Jewish cemetery where Adam and Eve were buried, along with others. Ironically, actually 4 couples, so you go back to that number 4 as its base. In the Zohar tells us that the cave of Machpelah is the gateway to the Garden of Eden. And in an esoteric sense, we can see the Garden of Eden as being representative as a pleasant, productive, harmonious state of consciousness in which are all possibilities of growth. So let's for a second backtrack to that word I mentioned, ta, for cell. To be in a cell with no windows is to be in complete darkness. The divine conceals itself in darkness, and one must have the faith to reach into that dark essence in order to reveal the light hidden inside. It's something worth meditating on. It can also relate to the divine hiding in matter, the darkness of matter, or even in the darkness of our suffering, our ignorance and obscurity. So when we develop this faith, when we live by these laws and observe the mark of divinity in creation, a certain truth is revealed to us. So anyone who has witnessed their magical or spiritual practices come to fruition, they see that there is a truth in the discipline they have learned. It starts to give results to the practitioner. So this word truth, emet in Hebrew, the first, middle, and last letter of the Hebrew alphabet spells this word. And notice that truth is sealed with the last letter, tav. Tav is sealed with truth because truth is not found at the beginning of a journey or progression, yet it is found at the end. So each initiation one goes through in life is a tav. It is a mark in their life, yet it also leads to a certain truth at its end once we've experienced it. So one of the last things that we're going to talk about, referring to Tav, is Tav as the cross. So the cross that we see, we typically relate to Christianity, Catholicism, but the cross is a universal symbol found throughout the whole world. And to take up the cross represents a sort of unity that happens within us when we dedicate ourselves to a spiritual path. It is the unification of our mind, our body, soul, and heart. So by doing this, we become a source of love and compassion, as opposed to this shell of hate and fear. This process is not an easy one, and one goes through much suffering on their path to get to this point. There are many things in which we must sacrifice, many things we must give up in our lives, which hides our true selves. Therefore, we can also see this cross as a form of self-sacrifice, the crucifixion of the old self in order to become reborn as the true self. So I know a lot of you are interested in tying other spiritual practices, other religions, other paths, tying them together and kind of seeing the comparisons between that and Kabbalah, as well as other things. I, for one, am guilty of this. I love seeing the correlation between different practices, although when we do our practices, we know that we shouldn't be crossing streams too much. We should be using, this is what systems are for, really. We should be dedicating ourselves to one particular system for the most part. But for those of you who are interested in this, I thought I'd entertain you a little bit by kind of showing you how the practice of Kundalini, as well as Eastern practices of yoga, can very much relate to what we're talking about, and a little bit of a different way to see this letter Tav, as well as the Tree of Life. So the Tree of Life, we can see it as the human body, right? The right pillar can represent the pranic channel of Ida, that they call in Sanskrit, and the left pillar can represent the pranic channel of Pingala. So the middle pillar then would represent the central channel and our spinal cord, our central nervous system, which is the Shushumna. So there's a famous diagram in the Kabbalah where the serpent of wisdom is traveling up the tree. This can be compared to the serpent power, or the Deva Kundalini, also known as Mother Kundalini in the East. There's many different words for this word Kundalini that you can find all over the world that are all relating to the same concept. For now, I'm just using this as an Eastern term since we're going to be looking at this in an Eastern perspective. So the middle pillar can be seen as where the chakras in the human body are. The root chakra, or the base chakra, would be in Malkut in this case. And this is where the serpent rests before it is awakened. This is why it ends with Tav, because it is sealed there. And Malkut, the physical world, is where we must do the work to wake it up. In the Eastern systems, it is said the serpent rises up through the chakras, opening the heart and rising to the crown of the head. There's that word crown again, referring to Keter. So this can be seen as Tiferet, beginning with the Tav, as it first goes to the heart. It then reaches the crown, Keter, where another Tav exists, but in a balanced form. And if you study the concept of Kundalini and yoga, you will know that there's ways of imbalancing this energy and ways of balancing it. So symbolically, we're seeing that this energy has reached its peak to the crown of the head, and it is in a balanced fashion right now. It is in a balanced manner. So the yogis then say that this serpent power must travel back into the heart of the yogi, where it must reside, opening the heart of the practitioner. Hence the other Tav in the word Tiferet, which is now sealing it with the truth and the mark of the divine. Tav spelt out in full is actually Tav and Vav, showing that Tav has a special relationship with the letter Vav. Vav can be seen as the spinal cord in the human being. If you look at the shape of the letter, it actually can resemble a head or a brain with the spinal cord going down. So Vav as the spine is the connector for the upper and lower worlds within us, the central nervous system, just as Vav is in the name of Tetragrammaton. a connector of the higher and lower world. The spine is our central nervous system, and many magical and spiritual practices and disciplines involve tuning the nervous system, rooting out the junk to make room for the new and higher energies to come through. In a sense, it is to ensure our nervous systems can handle such energies without having a destructive effect on us, hence imbalancing that serpent power. Interestingly, some Kabbalists call the central nervous system the throne of God within us. And if you do a little bit of study on the central nervous system, you will find a very deep meaning with them saying this and having this saying. So that covers most of the, well, actually, all the topics that I wanted to talk about. However, like I said, there's a complexity of meanings to each letter. I'm sure that you can find more if you dive into it, but hopefully this is a good base for you to start with and to move on from here. Before we end this lecture, I kind of wanted to just add a quote from the book of Revelation in order for you to have something to kind of meditate on. It's actually Revelation 2:10, if you want to go out and look it up and find it as a means of meditation. It's almost could be used as a mantra if you're focusing on the letter Tav, because this one saying in it, literally, when I read it personally, it gives all these ideas of what we've just talked about tied into this sentence or two. So again, bringing up the things that we talked about: suffering, the cell, the prison, the ta, being tested with resistance, the crown or keter, life, death, faith, Saturn we brought up, which again Saturn I spoke of as being also symbolic of Capricorn. In the tarot, in the Kabbalah, we know that Capricorn is symbolic of the devil archetype, that which tests us or challenges us. So just keep these words in mind as I read this little sentence, and maybe you can see the significance of what I'm talking about. It's actually 2 sentences, or more than that. But again, maybe it might serve as a nice little mantra for you. So from the book of Revelation 2:10, it says, "Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to cast some of you into prison, so that you will be tested, and you will have tribulation for 10 days. Be faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life." Thank you all for taking the time to listen. We will go to the next letter within the next week or two, and I look forward to hearing your comments, questions, concerns. Thank you for listening.